think that we're going to see a hell of a lot more Breitling. I think that vintage Breitling is going to make a Fast and Furious comeback, which is obviously not just a question of sort of collector trend, but also because the brand itself under George Kern is doing so much to raise awareness of its sort of pre-Navitimer and mid-Navitimer sort of vintage credentials. That's probably the big thing that I'm going to be focusing on.
I think what would be quite interesting to see is the trend that you see with what's happening with classic cars, whether or not that corresponds to watches, and that's a lot of cars from the 90s nowadays they're increasing in value, and I think watches is a little behind on that, but those people who were young in the 90s are now getting to that point where they've got more cash, they've got more disposable income, and so will they be looking at buying something that, you know, brings out that nostalgia from the 90s, from when they were in their childhoods, like you get with cars, because I think that's what is maybe driving the car market there for that period. And so is that going to happen with watches? I think that would be interesting to see.
Definitely. We can already see that with the Zenith Daytona, for example, prices are going up very, very quickly. And it's true that Breitling is definitely an undervalued brand at the moment. I think that still Patek and Rolex will continue to dominate the market, especially for vintage pieces. When I think about Rolex, I think obviously about Daytona. GMTs as well are doing extremely well at the moment. Patek, obviously Nautilus, but also the Aquanaut, I think, is doing very well at the moment. It used to be the poor cousin of the Nautilus, and now it's really building a market. So I think that's all very positive. And obviously in terms of vintage, I think that quality comes first, and that's something that the market is more and more keen on at the moment.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
I think the way people are buying as well, I think that'd be interesting to follow that, because social media nowadays is such a powerful tool that it's like, how long will it be before the main channels of sale become social media rather than, you know, already nowadays less people are buying in person. That'd be an interesting trend to follow.
Funny enough, yeah, recently we've had a problem where we've just been selling faster than people can even get to the website. So you put something on Instagram. We try not to put anything up too quickly, i.e. before it's live, but we have situations where in the last couple of weeks 3 or 4 pieces have gone up, and they've either sold within half an hour or 2 hours of
really
listing.
Impressive. And
sometimes we haven't even finished the marketing story that follows the post, and it's already gone. And people then start to question whether it's genuine or whether you didn't already pre-sell it, which is obviously a problem of its own. But social media is really radically changing things.
And I guess
especially Instagram, I think. Instagram is very, very powerful for watches. It works so well with just posting a picture and get an immediate response from the market and collectors, and I think that's definitely a very, very powerful instrument for dealers, collectors and auction houses as well.
Definitely. I think it's that connection with lifestyle, isn't it? Watches are such a lifestyle commodity.
Absolutely.
As well as an investment. You can wear your investment, can't you? You know, it's a bit different to having like all your money tied up in like a house or something. You can't take your house around and show it off to people, but a watch
there's always
is
the
more...
iPad and
yeah,
I know some people who do, but they shouldn't.
That's really interesting though about how fast they're selling online. Not online, sorry, on Instagram for you.
It's crazy. The last 6 months, a lot of the things that I never would have thought would have happened, where I was saying it was going to happen, but half the time I didn't 100% believe it. I was just sort of convincing myself and for other people. Actually, it's all happening. You know, people are just buying more and more without getting in touch. As soon as something goes on the website, done. As soon as it goes on social media, they're on the website, done. You know, you then have 3 or 4 people who are lined up in the inbox waiting, which is why we're now introducing waiting lists for everything, because you know, it's the easiest way to make up for someone missing something the previous round if you can give them a heads up in advance of the next round. It's crazy.
Personally, I think having AP doing pre-owned is actually really good. I think it can only encourage more people to buy pre-owned items. Like, as working in an auction house, I'd say one of the difficulties we have is the confidence that a client has to buy something that's really old, because you know, we live in a world where you break something, you can just buy a new one off the shelf. You can't do that with a 1940s chronograph. It's completely different, and that's, I suppose, that sort of nervousness and apprehension of something going horribly wrong. Having such a massive player as AP being like, no, it's actually okay, you know, even we believe in these, so why shouldn't you? Actually, kind of, I think it would only encourage people to buy more and bring it to those people's attention that you can buy something that's pre-owned and not just brand new.
I mean, just imagine a world where Rolex had done that 30 years ago. I mean, would we be in the quagmire that we're in today, the vintage Rolex market being riddled with uncertainty, if Rolex had taken the admittedly quite bold step of getting involved and saying, okay, so these parts are original, these parts aren't original. We don't have to change this if you don't want, but then obviously it's not guaranteed for waterproofness. You know, that dial looks like it's not original, but we can't take a definitive position on it. All those things would have avoided so many of the problems that we face today, which personally makes me stay away from the vintage Rolex market for the time being. And I think AP are probably coming in at just the right point, because actually only, I think it was 6 months ago when we had one of these panels, the last time I said the vintage brand that I would look out for the most is AP, and particularly vintage AP Royal Oaks, because they're just experiencing a fantastic growth profile at the moment. And actually, I think it makes perfect sense if the brand gets involved. Then suddenly you have transparency or additional transparency, you have authentication, you have curation, and they have to offer proper prices to clients, not discounted prices against trade-ins. If all they're going to be doing is offering clients trade-in values for their vintage pieces at discounts relative to new stock, then I think it'll fall on its feet relatively quickly. But if they're taking it seriously and they invest and buy new to sell to clients, then I think it's interesting.
Absolutely, I totally agree with you, and I think AP is a key market for watches, especially for vintage watches. You obviously have the Royal Oak, who is extremely strong. The market is really booming at the moment, not only for the vintage pieces but also for the modern pieces. But AP is not only the Royal Oak, and I think you also have a lot of vintage other examples that are very, very fascinating and still undervalued today. So that's one thing. The second thing is that obviously, as you said, it can be quite expensive to have an Audemars Piguet serviced, and it also takes a lot of time. You have to be very, very patient. And I think that when you have a brand with such a reputation, they have to really deliver a service in accordance with that reputation. And I think investing in those services is definitely going in the right direction. Now we have to see. I hope that they will also understand and really understand the needs and the point of view of the vintage collectors and the vintage market.
It's interesting actually how, so Rolex, the fear and constraint on so many collectors over so many decades has been you send your watch to Rolex, and if it's original and nice, it comes back at half the value and ruined, because they have a compulsion to make something waterproofed and as if new. But that seems to have radically improved in the last 18 months. Everyone keeps telling me that Rolex are getting more and more sensitive to need. And it makes me think about Tag Heuer, because Tag Heuer started their vintage watch restoration department about 18 months ago as well. And it was by invitation only, and it was very quiet. And then slowly it grew. And everyone that I know that collects Heuer, you know, they're even more nervous about things being changed than Rolex collectors virtually, and they all seem very comfortable with whatever it is that Tag's doing. And so if AP can sensitively protect the aspects of a watch when they buy it and restore it and resell it, that actually makes it iconic as a vintage watch, as opposed to transforming it into something that basically looks like a cobbled together Franken watch with new parts versus certain originals, that will be the change maker. If they can do that, then I think they're really smart.
So I think with Patek, they're in an interesting position in that with their modern stuff, it seems to be going away a bit from what they've done in the past, and that only, like with the 40th anniversary Nautilus and things like that, they seem to be maybe being supported by speculators rather than those who are actually passionate about watches. And then conversely with the vintage stuff, it seems like the iconic models, like your 1463 and your 2499, they are a little bit soft, and I don't know, maybe that then means that what we're going to be seeing next being boosted is like 3940s and 3970s, because they're keeping with Patek's tradition of, you know, innovation and perfection, but without being, I don't know, a bit like they're still in the same style rather than sort of stepping away like they are at the moment. So I think that would be interesting to watch out for. What is the next big thing for them that way?
I think that obviously the hot thing at the moment is really the Nautilus, and even the Stern family decided to push the prices quite a bit for the 5711 and 5712. So there is definitely, it's very, very hot at the moment. When it comes to vintage, I think that references like the 3448, for example, used to be undervalued again. And there is now a clear understanding of the market of those pieces, the aesthetic of the dial, the aesthetic of the case, the movement as well. So we can really see that the market is getting into those references. So perpetual calendars and complicated pieces. And obviously you also have the earlier pieces, when I think about the 1518, for example, who used to stay in the shadow of the 2499. Now it is really considered as the original one, because it is actually. And there is again a clear recognition of the market. So I think it is going in the right direction for Patek vintage.
I mean, I definitely echo what you've both said. I think that the Nautilus is just going nowhere other than up at the moment. It's a sort of the bulwark of the vintage Patek collection. The best conditions and the fuller the set, the better it does. I think actually touching on something you mentioned earlier, I think early Aquanauts are suddenly starting to just sort of push their head above the parapet and become collectible in a strange way, because suddenly you're seeing these early Aquanauts with patination on the index markers, and they're just sort of, they've suddenly caught the interest of that generation that couldn't necessarily justify or afford perhaps to buy a Nautilus, but wants something that's similarly iconic in a sports dressed context, and that's Patek. I wouldn't comment on the 1518 or the 2499 other than to say my gut tells me that maybe there's certain, not with the 1518, but with the 2499, particularly yellow gold, and that's sort of volume piece, quote unquote. I'd say that's stabilizing. But again, it's not my area of specialty. But the, I was just thinking, what else was there that's sort of getting interesting? From our point of view, I think people are always, I think the sort of case sizes that collectors are looking for now are sort of on the smaller side. So actually, I think if anything, vintage is going to outperform contemporary, because it's easier to find a 35, 36, 37, 38 millimeter dress watch from Patek from the 40s, 50s, 60s than it is to find an equivalent today. I think white metal dress Patek are just going to do well in the right sort of case size, but that's nothing new.
Yes, and you can also see that on more common references. If you take, for example, the 3940, which is a kind of a common Patek because it was mass-produced, you can really see that obviously white gold platinum versions are doing extremely well, but also yellow gold versions, who used to have a very stable market, are now starting going up in prices. So I think you can really see the evolution of the market, and as you said, the sizes of the watches people are interested in are now being reduced, and so classical pieces, timeless design are really in favor with the market.
I think something that would be quite interesting, going back to what we were saying about AP and what they're doing. One of the impressions I get for why your early big massive watches aren't going as strong as they could be is because Patek have done a lot of restoration for people, and it's knowing what was the original and what is actually being redone, and so people's perhaps a little bit more nervous about what they're buying, and so that's something that AP have got to bear in mind, is how much do they restore when they sell their new heritage pieces. It's
like a big advantage.
Yeah, it's because it makes a big difference in what someone's willing to invest in.
Funnily enough, just the one thing that I meant to mention was picking up on the 3940. I'm completely biased. I bought a 1989 white gold 3940 as the first watch I ever properly invested in, and I completely agree, for entirely self-interested reasons, that they're going to do fantastically well. But no, I do think that there's a sort of a classicism of size and design and a sort of a shape and contour to the case, in addition to a really iconic, quite reductionist sort of perpetual calendar dial design, that in the 3940 you hit, absolutely, the nail on the head with. And funnily enough, the one thing I'd pick up on is, and this is something I've only really opened my mind to recently, is actually the earlier yellow gold pieces with the very first execution dials. Sunken, just fantastic. Sunken, and also the calendar, the sub-dial at 9 o'clock on the very earliest executions is very different to the later ones, like a really quite odd one, actually. And those I've sort of completely fallen in love with. I really think they're fantastic. If I can get one, I'll get one. But they're great. Oh, they're fantastic. I think they're going to do really well. But anyway, you didn't hear it from me.
Well, I think it depends if you are on the seller's perspective. Traditionally, you have a lot of watches in the UK from the 50s, 60s, Rolex and Omega. So to me, a typical English watch is a 5508 Rolex, for example. That's something you can really find, and you have a lot of them in the UK, or 5513 with Explorer dial, for example. You have a lot of those in the UK. So that's from the seller's perspective. From the buyer's perspective, I think that London is incredibly international city. You have a lot of buyers coming from all around the world and gathering in London, and you also have people that, for example, are European, French, Belgian, Italian, and you actually only see them in London because everybody comes to London for business or for pleasure, but there is always a bit of part of business in it.
Yeah, well, London's so accessible, isn't it? And I think at the moment the exchange rate is just only making London even more attractive and has really refocused attention here. And so I guess that's the next challenge, is to make sure that attention, when hopefully the exchange rate goes up, stays here. And we've got to take advantage of the strength at the moment and keep people interested.
Yeah, we will see with the Brexit as well how it goes, and because that can have an impact.
I mean, I definitely agree that the currency advantage is important, has been for the last 18 months. But I think the fundamentals, I've become more and more convinced that the fundamentals actually of the vintage watch market here in the UK, and also London-based vintage watch businesses, the advantages they enjoy are so significant, because you find yourself, you're on the edge of Europe, without going into that debate, which means that you're accessible geographically and relatively sort of conveniently in many different integrated ways in terms of clients who are interested from the continent. The North American market is just extraordinary, and so I mean, our biggest growth market is North America. It's just ridiculously, the potential is huge, and so actually they just love buying from across the pond, with the convenience of getting on the phone and speaking to someone in the same language, roughly in the same time zone, with sort of comfort around the legal system, etc., and the same vocabulary that means that people are generally speaking, talking about the same thing when they use the same words at any given moment. And then there's Australia and the booming vintage watch market over there, and London is just this perfect international hub for crossing over between different cultures, different transit points when traveling globally, less and less language barriers, less and less currency barriers. It's great, and then it just fits with the whole. We've been doing things for a long time. Retail is something that we've always been relatively good at as a country, and so when you combine all those things, actually, it's a pretty sweet spot to be in. I'm pretty lucky. I mean, I was joking about the Platinum 1518, the mythical watch that no one knows whether it exists or not. But in practical terms, I would probably buy a Daniel's pocket watch, or even a Daniel's wristwatch if ever it were possible, particularly one with a tourbillon. I would buy probably a split-second Eberhard chronograph in all original condition. I might buy a perfect 3700 Nautilus. Those are probably my three top sort of immediate sort of go-to ideas.
I think I'd go all out and go spend all my money, all this imaginable money I have, and I'd go for a Patek 2523, enamel dial, world time. As I really like world times, and that's kind of as fancy as you can get, really, isn't it? If you've got an unlimited budget.
Well, I was thinking about the 1415 actually, enamel dial as well, so we're quite close.
Go halves.
We go halves. We can share them.
Exactly. You pay, I wear it.
Oh. 10,000, I think quite an easy buy of 10,000 would be like, a nice Speedmaster from sort of 80s. If I was, being a bit cheeky and go a bit over my 10,000 budget, I'd like to go for like, a nice Lange one. I think they're always lovely.
That's a smart choice, I think, in modern pieces. I think Lange is doing extremely well. The quality of the pieces are very, very good. I think that, yes, Speedmasters, definitely, that's a good choice, still undervalued at the moment. I would also maybe go for a Longines, a vintage chronograph, 13ZN, 30CH. I mean, these are also obvious choices in terms of quality. I think it's astonishing. It's fantastic dials as well. For vintage Omegas, you also have the 33.3 earlier chronographs, with also again fantastic dials with like multi-colors dials. So I think the good thing with watches is that you can really find fantastic pieces at any budget. And this is why, for example, in our catalogs we're obviously very proud to have watches at 100 to 100,000, but also pieces that are fresh to the market, very well preserved at £4,000 to £6,000, for example.
Very accessible, isn't it?
Yes, I think this is one of the best things with watches, is that you can really find something at any price. So
you'll have to introduce me to your 13ZN dealer at sub £10,000, because I'd buy this hand off.
It will be in yellow, not in steel.
Well, still, I'd love to find one. No, I think those are all fantastic suggestions, actually. I think, well, I'd love to get a 13ZN, that's for sure. But I think I'd probably go for a Breitling Copilot, maybe just because of the case characteristics, the history, the current ascendance, early ascendance of the brand, the fact that it's a chronograph, just the dark configuration. For me, I think that's something I'd buy for about that price point.
For me, it wasn't a watch per se, more a watchmaker. And that my first job straight out of university was at a jeweller's back home in the Midlands, and we had a watchmaker on site who was pretty much the only Rolex trained watchmaker in that area. And he was just so generous with his knowledge, and just the nicest man you could possibly meet. And so I used to help him do the basic repairs of battery changing and stuff. And so he would, he was always telling me bits and bobs about them. And then when I moved to Bonhams, I think the first watch that really sort of spoke to me as such, because I'd always appreciated them, but the one that was like, wow, actually, watches are incredible. There was way more to them than just, telling the time and how nice they look. And I think that would be a Reverso. And what I really like about Reversos is that design has pretty much stayed the same since 1931, and that every sort of reinvention as such that they do, you can still see the original in it. It's like it doesn't get lost, and they can do all sorts of, lovely decorations. And that the enamel ones that they do, that we had a lovely one a few years ago, which was it was an eclipse one, and it was part of their nude range, and it just had like a little part of a painting from the Louvre, and I just thought it was just so nice. It's just, it's really interesting what you can do with it without losing that originality of design. And I think that's what sort of made me realise, actually this is an amazing world to be part of.
I remember the first watch. So it was when I was 17. My parents decided to offer me a watch, very traditionally, and I knew nothing about watches at that time. And so I just started looking at watches, and I just never stopped. So 15 years later, I'm still looking at watches. And it took me actually 2 years to find a watch. And we have a family tradition to have a Cartier as a first watch. And so I went for the Cartier Basculante in manual winding yellow gold.
Interesting that you say Basculante when I was saying about reversing.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so I still have it, I still wear it, and still enjoy it for different reasons today than a couple of years ago, but still enjoying it every time I wear it. So that's how I got into watches personally. What about you?
Well, funnily enough, I got my great-grandfather's pocket watch for my 18th birthday, but I can't say that it really sort of quickened the heartbeat. It wasn't really until I was doing this professionally that I came across a watch, one of the first actually independent watches that we sold by Kari Voutilainen, a observatoire, the very first observatoire he ever made. And it just really, really, really tugged at the heartstrings when we sold it. And I didn't realize until it had sold just how much I liked it. And even today, you know, whenever I get asked, I always say the same question. This particular watch just sort of caught me. And I have a standing offer to the gentleman who owns it, who I currently know at least, that if he ever sells it, you know, I'd desperately like to talk to him. Because there was just something about, it had a Peseux 260 movement, which was a fantastic Guibourch chronometer grade, highly accurate, used by Longines and others. It was a very simple case before Kari introduced teardrop lugs. It had straight lugs, which ironically he's now brought back decades later, more than a decade later. It had a really very simple reductionist dial, unlike modern Voutilainen, where it was just monotone but with slight ridges, almost as trenches for separating the center of the dial from the outside of the dial. I think from recollection it had applied Arabic numerals but not Breguet. Again, almost sort of Art Deco, the way the dial felt. And I just absolutely loved it. And it was rose gold, which was never a case material I'd ever usually consider, you know, to be amongst my favorites. But actually, it just worked perfectly. Everything worked perfectly, and to this day, it's still the one watch that I feel got away. But you know, I wasn't in a position to buy it. I was selling it. It was a job, and such is life. But yeah, that one really got me interested in independence.